Saturn cosmology. Central to a reconstruction of ancient planetary history is the acknowledgement of the primacy of the planet Saturn. This has come about through comparative mythology studies. In modern times, has been promulgated by David Talbot in his book, The Saturn Myth, published in 1980. This important detective work and its later iterations by other scholars have furthered an understanding on a planetary arrangement completely different than today. There are now extensive writings and a number of videos that flesh out this evidence. The most significant one to date is Talbot's Symbols of an Alien Sky. It is a heartwarming and eye-opening view of a missing chapter in Earth's history, and I would totally suggest watching that if you haven't already seen it. And even watching it a couple times is good. This reality is one of the most important memories of the ancient world. The era when Saturn reigned was a time when Earth was bathed in the light and warmth. According to many myths, humans had abilities far beyond what we have today. We could talk with the animals, had a radiant light body, could levitate or fly, and the veil between life and death was slight. The best reconstruction so far, Saturn was the central illuminating body that sat nearly motionless in the heavens above the North Pole. Saturn was our original sun, a sub-brown dwarf star that itself came to orbit around our current sun. Depending on which Saturnian theorist you embrace, Saturn either carried with it or recaptured the other solar planets in a sub- or suprapolar conjunction. The planets strung out like beads on a piece of hanging wire or twine, the whole edifice orbiting around the sun. Saturn was in the middle with Neptune above, and then Uranus with its tippy axis at the topmost. According to Talbot, immediately below Saturn was Venus, then Mars, and then Earth. Janot Cook, another Saturnian, has Mercury in a place of Venus, with Venus off to the side of Saturn, connected by a curved plasma stream. This was the rib that Adam, Saturn, broke from his body to create Eve, Venus. Most Saturnians recognize that the super-hot electrified Venus was born out of Saturn through some unexplained eruption, and that sometime in its early existence Venus acted like a renegade comet. Immanuel Velikovsky thought that Venus emerged from Jupiter, but this appears to be an error according to most, and there are some who have speculated that's why the red spot exists. Many Saturnians hesitate to put a date on it, but tend to agree that Venus was hatched either prior or early during what Talbot calls the era of the gods, when Saturn enjoyed its prominence. This period was the Greek Golden Age, the Hebraic Garden of Eden. This massive Saturn-entrained conjunction that lasted more than 1,000 years, and possibly much longer, can be seen represented in the ubiquitous images of the so-called Venus figurines, aka the Michelin tire man with the bulbous curves. These curves were the outlines of the glow mode plasma comas that enveloped each planet. What a sight for our ancestors to contemplate and render and sculpture down through the ages. No wonder that we embraced this vision in the abode of the gods, for the gods were the planets, and we watched and learned from them with reverence. Everything they did, we desired to reenact. As above, so below was our human motto. Saturn cosmology can be broke down into 3 periods. The middle being the great reign of benevolence, when the massive planetary conjunction was most stable and the skies had cleared so humans could see what was going on. For Saturnians, the beginning of this period is recognized as the time of creation, the basis for most indigenous creation myths. Prior to this time, there are a few different credible scenarios on how this formation came in being. They each explain how Saturn came to be influenced by the Sun, having been captured by it, and possibly assisted by the agency of a massive Jupiter, which was never part of the Saturn system. This situation is worthy of added study, as the subject is beyond the scope of this video. This early history with Saturn's possible role in previous era ending Earth catastrophes is a fascinating topic. Certainly at the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, something spectacular occurred with Saturn to cause the massive megafauna species to die off. Further back, it is possible to conjecture that Saturn had a hand in the other mass extinction periods, if it was an influence that came and went periodically through the solar system.
Issues about which David and I disagreed concerned the Proto-Saturnian configuration. As I, together with other colleagues of mine, have posited, this configuration involved 3 planets, Venus, Mars and Earth, in a linear configuration that was axially strung along the Birkeland current emanating from Proto-Saturn's southern pole. Not only that, but taking our cue from Ralph Jurgens, some of us have accepted that this configuration had been travelling outside the demarcation of the solar system before it penetrated the Sun's heliospheric boundary on its way towards the Sun. It is not that David himself did not agree with this. In fact, he did. As he pointed out to me towards the end of 2010, such a configuration could only have existed while it was travelling through the Sun's heliosphere. Prior to that, while it had still been outside the solar system, the configuration's planetary brood would have been in equatorial orbit around Proto-Saturn. The mathematical calculations he conducted led him to believe that the transformation of the equatorially orbiting planets into a linear configuration would have taken 80 years maximum to 30 years minimum. Having visited Lynn Rose in Casa Grande, Arizona in October of the same year, David said he had debated this concept with him and that Rose was in total agreement with him. As I pointed out to David in February of the following year, Rose's agreement on this issue surprised me, since throughout the years he had been vociferously adamant that at no time would the Proto-Saturnian configuration have ever achieved polar linearity. Rose and I had debated this point for years, and unless David misunderstood him, it was heartening to hear that he had finally accepted it, even if only for the relatively short duration of the configuration's passage through the heliosphere. Truth be told, however, Rose's view and David's had earlier been proposed by Wal Thornhill. Allow me, however, to backtrack a little. This is a photo Dwight took of me at the 1995 centenary celebration of Velikovsky's birth in New York. We had a lot of fun together, David and I, on that trip. Allow me, however, to backtrack a little. As I had stated back in 1978, this axial planetary coupling had been the greatest stumbling block in my own unravelling of the Proto-Saturnian scenario. As far as I knew at that particular time, there were no such coupled bodies known from anywhere in the universe. Worse than that, I was also under the false impression that celestial mechanics, as then known, would not allow for such coupling. Despite bold attempts by others to solve this problem, I could never accept any of the theoretical underpinnings they proposed for such linearity. And yet, that such linear formations did exist in space eventually came to me through the discovery of the jetting star designated as HD 163296 that I had come across while browsing through the internet. I had actually circulated a photograph of this formation that included 3 objects strung along its axial jet during the private roundtable discussion by the speakers at the Chronia Communications World Conference held in Portland, Oregon in September 2000. That was an unforgettable meeting. Unfortunately, the astrophysicist Halton Arp, who was also present, mistook the photograph for the controversial runaway body that was said to be streaming away from the double star system known as TMR1, which he therefore brushed away as irrelevant to the discussion that was taking place. I was, however, very elated when, during the same round of discussions, Arp himself declared that linear formations are not uncommon in the cosmos. When, a month later, I asked him what linearly coupled formations he had in mind, he referred me to Herbig-Haro objects, concerning which he himself had already published 2 photographs of the one designated as HH34. He was actually apologetic when I told him that the photograph of HD 163296 that I had circulated in Portland delineated just such an object, spurting star. Although the first of these formations had been detected in the 19th century, the discoverer Shelburne Wesley had no idea what it was he had discovered. It was not until the independent studies by George Herbig and Guillermo Haro, for whom the objects became named, that by the 1940s these formations began to be understood as possible stellar formative structures. Let no one think that these objects are rare throughout our galaxy. There are actually hundreds of them, maybe even more. More than that, and this is what had attracted me to these objects in the first place, the system associated with HD 163296, the picture of which I had circulated at the Chronia conference, was actually labelled by NASA as a young planetary system. Once this confusion between Arp and I was settled, in other words, once he realised that he had mistaken the photograph I had circulated for an entirely different object, he let me know that he too was of the opinion that planets could be formed through stellar ejected axial currents. As he explained, and this is a quote, "The HH objects, Herbig-Haro objects, indeed show luminous knots obviously ejected in a line from a central source. I included a picture of HH34 in my book, Seeing Red. The purpose of that inclusion is to demonstrate that such ejections happen on both galactic and stellar scales in the universe." And he has in italics, "I personally consider the outrageous possibility that planets could originate in such fashion also." End of quote. Although Arp gave me permission to divulge the views he expressed to me in private, he was also adamant to keep his musings in context. Thus, to be fair, none of the above is to say that Arp agrees with the Proto-Saturnian scenario. Stellar collimated bipolar outflows, also known as jets, similar to the Birkeland current axis that joined the planets in the Proto-Saturnian configuration, are now known to be common in interstellar space. They are, in fact, part and parcel of Herbig-Haro objects. Cosmic linearity, however, is not to be encountered merely in Herbig-Haro objects. Comets, too, have been known to exhibit linear formations. One of the best examples of such cometary configurations was dramatically displayed in July 1994, when comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 broke into 21 fragments that ended up strung out like pearls on a string before catastrophically ploughing into the planet Jupiter. It was in fact this comet that Wal Thornhill has been promoting as an example of the manner in which the Proto-Saturnian system could have been linearly formed. Just as it was Jupiter's gravitational pull that was responsible for the fragmentation of the comet and the stretching of those fragments into their now famous lineup, so also, according to Thornhill, was the Sun's heftier attraction responsible for the breakup of the Proto-Saturnian system into its linear planetary configuration. And as already noted, this was the reasoning that David Salkeld adhered to too. Comets, however, need not fragment in order to resolve themselves into a string of linear formations. As Marinus van der Sluis has brought to the attention of his readers in relation to this subject, comets can sprout as many as 3 separate tails. Those tails, designated as type 1, can sometimes exhibit bright knots of condensed matter strung out along their rectilinear emissions. Fair enough, with or without such condensed lumps, comets remain denizens of the solar system and thus subjected to the Sun's influence. Yet how much different is that from Herbig-Haro objects which are subjected to the influence of their host stars? Would not the planets that were linearly aligned within Proto-Saturn's axial current have also been subjected to their host star before they were disrupted by our present Sun on entry into the solar system's sphere of influence? As it finally had to be admitted, the most important aspect of the Herbig-Haro phenomenon is arguably the unique insights which it has provided into the processes that lead to the formation of stars. That leads to the ejection of quasars from galaxies. As Brian Hills points out, this is an unorthodox idea, but one that is slowly gaining ground. As he explains, and I quote, "The ejection process usually involves shooting pairs of quasars in opposite directions out from the active centre of the galaxy along the poles of the galaxy. Indeed, pairs of quasars in the central galaxy often lie on a straight line." As Arp himself found reason to ask, if stars and quasars can be ejected in this manner, why not planets? And that, to be sure, was quite a daring proposal, even by one who, for other reasons, had already been ostracised from the scientific community. Planetary systems outside our own solar one were still considered somewhat hypothetical at the time Ralph Jurgens considered Earth to have belonged to just such an array. Today, multiple planet systems are held to be quite common beyond the Sun. Some of these systems, which may have been spawned by brown dwarf stars, have been described as bizarre configurations. As far as the accepted theory is concerned, planets coagulated out of the debris, said to be mainly dust and gas, contained in circumstellar disks. What was being discovered in exoplanetary systems, however, was turning this theory, known as core accretion, on its head. If planets were really formed out of circumstellar disks, they should end up circling in the same direction as their host star's rotational vector. On the contrary, quite a few exoplanets were found to be orbiting in the opposite direction of their host star, which astronomers at the European Southern Observatory consider a serious challenge to current theories of planet formation. Not only that, but newer models of planet formation keep being upset by newer discoveries. As Hal Levison, then at the Southwest Research Institute in Boulder, Colorado, stated, and I quote him word for word, "These models are crap. They may be the best we can do, but they are still crap." End of quote. And yet, while he criticises the prevailing core accretion model, he continues to champion it, believing that it only needs to become more sophisticated. Where have we heard all this before? Enough, the replicated system was merely a computerised artificiality. It closely resembled what astrophysicists observe in real stellar jets, and that's a quotation, and has therefore been touted as one of the greatest astrophysical experiments that's ever been done. According to the Nobel laureate Hans Alfvén, it is vast magnetic vortices in space operating through what is known as a pinch effect that draws plasma together to form not only galaxies and galaxy clusters, but also stars and planets. And it is the jet-embedded knots in question, more correctly known as plasmoids, that evolve into planetesimals and eventually into planets. Judging by what has been and continues to be discovered in the world's Arctic regions, A stationary source of heat located in Earth's north celestial pole is not only called for, but has actually been implied by mainstream paleontologists. And in order for this stationary source of heat to accomplish all that is being discovered, it needs to have been in existence since day one. I will not say that I would have been able to convince David concerning all of this had he not left us so unexpectedly. There are others who have accepted the Proto-Saturnian scenario without having yet been convinced of this particular stance.
A very similar set to atmospheric physics. The temperature here for this hot Jupiter is 1100 Kelvin, which sits within the regime of the temperatures that you get for brown dwarfs. So the physics are common, but for brown dwarfs you get really high signal noise data, whereas for exoplanets you don't get high signal noise data. So they're a great laboratory for understanding the kinds of things that you might expect to see for exoplanets, or the kinds of processes that are probably happening for exoplanets.
The cradle of life gets back to the idea of the Garden of Eden period in man's memory. If you're a satellite orbiting within that anode glow, and this is not an outrageous idea because astronomers have suggested the same thing for red giants, that planets could actually orbit within that star because the atmosphere is such low density. In fact, we orbit in the sun's atmosphere, if you like, and it doesn't cause us any trouble. But within that glowing shell, the radiant energy received from that envelope is constant over the entire globe. The light from the plasmasphere is not reflected light, it's radiant energy. Brown dwarfs radiate blue and ultraviolet light even though they are cool at a temperature around 950 K. This is further evidence that we are looking at a mix of an electrical red anode glow and coronal ultraviolet blue end of the spectrum. There are no seasons, no tropics and no ice caps. A planet does not have to rotate, its axis can point in any direction and its orbit can be eccentric, and you'll still get this beautiful even temperature over the whole body. The radiant energy received by the planet will be strongest at the blue and red ends of the spectrum, so photosynthesis, which relies on red light, would be very active. The skylight would be a pale purple, which maybe is referred to by the classical purple dawn of creation. And I know that in Canberra we have this new arboretum, which is fantastic, and all of the new trees that are being planted are put in red plastic to start with, and I asked the head of the arboretum why they did that, and he said the plants grow much better in red light. Water molecules dominate the spectra of brown dwarfs, so you want to know where the Earth's water came from? The light on Earth was dim and purplish amid a continuous mist of water. No other bodies in the system were visible. And this is what Dave mentioned yesterday. This explains the abundant water on Earth and many satellites of the gas giant planets and the rings of Saturn. And the red light, warmth and water was ideally suited for giant ferns. It explains the gigantic lush vegetation found at the poles, fossilised as coal. Now, the problem faced by life on planets orbiting a red star, I think you saw last night, which was this flaring red dwarf. So this tendency to flare up is a problem. The reason for this is that, as I said, the red stars don't have the current regulation afforded by the bright photosphere. So the response of a red star to a sudden electrical disturbance in their environment is to shed charged matter in a flare-up. They may also change in apparent size as the anode glow accommodates to the electrical environment. I think this would account for the great dyings in the geological record and the episodic deposit of vast sediment and mineral layers on the Earth, and on other bodies too. Every body that's been looked at is layered. What's more, it explains for the first time the oceans of salty water on Earth. Comets cannot be responsible because they have little or no water and little or no sodium chloride. Now, just see how much of this I want to show you, because we saw this yesterday, so I might skip. This is referring to that super flare you saw yesterday. And you remember the astrophysicist said anyone who was on a planet orbiting that star at the time would be having a very bad day. Well, I think the Earth has had its bad days, and they're reflected in the geological record. So we'll skip that. The mass extinctions. As I said, those flare-ups can be so drastic that it would practically wipe out the life on any existing life on those satellites of that dwarf star. Ironically, intelligent life can't communicate through such a plasma shell using radio waves, so the lack of intelligible radio signals in the SETI project is understandable. In fact, denizens of such worlds would most likely be unaware of the universe at large. Now, astronomers also submit that orbiting a red dwarf is possibly one of the best places to look for life. What they've never considered is orbiting inside a red dwarf. A recent report of a spotty brown dwarf which suggests there are things orbiting within that red anode sheath, causing a dimming of the glow behind wherever that satellite happens to be. They're calling it weather, but of course if it's an anode glow it has nothing to do with weather. So this is a picture of the brown dwarf proto-Saturn as I see it. Now there would have been many more bodies than you see there, but I've included Mars and Earth and proto-Saturn because they're the main players at this stage. 50% of red dwarfs have Earth-sized planets in their conventional habitable zone. This suggests there are a large number hidden inside the red star's glow. And you can say that too because our gas giants all have large numbers of satellites orbiting quite closely. But you'll note there is no Venus at this stage. Gigantism. It wasn't just pterodactyls that struggled to get up off the ground. Scaling of muscle and bone strength shows that dinosaurs could not have raised their bodies off the ground in today's gravity. For them to move about, Earth's gravity needed to be about 1/3 of today's. Global extinction and fossilization requires far more than a simple impact. Clearly, we have no understanding of the cause of gravity.
There are quite a few things that lead me to believe that this is a likely event. One of them is axial tilt families. Saturn, Mars, the Earth are about 4 degrees varying from each other. Solar system is kind of a odd collection of planets with different axial tilts. I know that Venus is upside down and rotating clockwise, but it's hot and it's relatively a new planet, and it's very possible that when it was still in its formative phase, it got booted out of the Saturn system. But for Earth, Mars, and Saturn to have the same tilt is an indicator that they belong to the same family. I know there's a theory that the tilt of the Earth moved that caused an extinction event, but that's with the 4 billion year old story. And I guess it's possible that the tilt of the Earth could have moved while it was being displaced from Saturn and put into place where it is now, going around the sun. You know, they say that life is stranger than fiction, and I would take a pretty good imagination to think of something like this happening. But to think that a planet started as a grain of dust and it accreted into a full-size planet with an atmosphere and water that was brought to it by comets that they don't find any water on is even harder for me to believe. When compared to the spin axis of the Sun, the spin axis of the planets fall into 2 groups. Jupiter, Mercury, and Venus all have their axes at about the same inclination as the axis of the Sun. The spin axis of Saturn and the planets Earth, Mars, and Neptune are all within less than 1 degree of 30.9 degrees different from the spin axis of the Sun. Mercury revolves at the equator of the Sun, but its orbit is understood to be an incline by 7 degrees from the ecliptic. Ecliptic is defined by the plane of the Earth's orbit. The inclination of the Earth's orbit deviates by 0 degrees from the ecliptic, but it's actually at an angle of 7 degrees to the Sun's equator. The discrepancies in the rotational axis of the planets show more clearly if they're all compared to the rotational axis of the Sun. So it's more than likely that either Saturn, Earth, and Mars came into the Sun's system, or perhaps it was the other way around. Maybe the Sun came in to the Saturn system. I think it's probably more than likely that Saturn was the interloper, because then you would have achieved the linear configuration that they're talking about. I don't see how that could have happened unless the Sun blew by and pulled the planets out. I suppose that could have happened. Maybe that is what happened. You know, that would explain why instead of Saturn receding away from the Sun, perhaps the Earth was being pulled from the Sun away from Saturn. I suppose that could be a scenario that would work. Either way, something had to have happened like this, because our solar system looks like a train wreck. Most of them have hot Jupiters really close to their Sun. Massive Jupiters give birth to rocky core planet. I think that scenario is a lot more believable than the one that is being sold to us. And then for gigantism to not be able to exist with today's gravity, then it would stand to reason that if the Earth once had less gravity, 2/3 less gravity, that's pretty significant. Gigantism would be a lot more likely, and that would mean people too. There's your fabled giants. I don't think that's a myth. I think that's true, and that would be totally in line with a smaller Earth that had less water and gravity. It might even explain how they could have put 100-ton blocks in precise locations in the Great Pyramid and Stonehenge too. And they were maybe copying what they saw in the sky. I know there's one star right now that looks like a step pyramid, and you know, so those configurations that were in the sky, I can see how they could have influenced ancient man a lot more than with the sky we see today. Mainstream still does not seem to grasp that planets, such as the Earth, Titan, or Mars, could orbit inside the plasmasphere. They call it weather. Well, to an extent, that may be right. It would be weather for the planets inside, I suppose. Seems like it was a paradise lost. The more you learn about it, maybe that's where the whole term came from. Kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Makes complete sense to me. The only bad thing, most likely, would be that it occasionally flares. Doesn't have the prominence of a star like the Sun. When you think about it, you know, we lost a great thing, most likely. On the other hand, I don't think it would be all that great if it was dusk and raining all the time either. There wouldn't be no such thing as a sunny day. We wouldn't even be aware of the universe that surrounds us until we got to the space age. But I often wonder what that environment would be like between those two planets. It's pretty obvious that life once existed on Mars, a civilization of some sort. It could still be there for all we know. Something happened where Mars lost its atmosphere. Really makes you think, man. Could people fly between the two planets? It might sound weird or crazy, but it stimulates the imagination for sure. So the Earth must have been much smaller to have 1/3 the amount of gravity it has today. Everything was bigger. There was a lot more oxygen in the atmosphere. You know, still haven't found out where fresh water comes from, but how can it be that some water on Earth is salt water and some water is fresh? How come it just don't all get mixed up? Eventually, I think they'd all be somewhere. And dinosaurs, wow, them big massive creatures. Their sizes are beyond belief. I think that's why all children, including myself, were attracted to dinosaurs right off. And it's always the T-Rex, you know. Think about them things walking around. And then just think about how amazing it must have been and mind-blowing, mind-bending for that canopy to come open and, you know, ancient man witnessed the stars for the first time. And you got all these plasma formations around. It must have been a pretty crazy time to be alive. I could see why they would do the things they did. Were trying to wrap their heads around it. The idea of being on the menu isn't very appealing. 30-foot wingspan birds flying around scooping up people and eating them wouldn't be very appealing either. Honey, watch the kids. So I guess there's 6 to 1 and half dozen to another. That's what I would think. If I had my choice, well, I'd have to experience it there for a while. Humans, we make them pets. It'd be pretty tough to beat life on Earth. Teach them how to kill. For me.
All in all, What follows is a preview of a more comprehensive reconstruction yet to come that will unite the myths surrounding Jupiter and Saturn with the observations of modern astronomy, archaeology, and a growing number of interdisciplinary fields of study. Along the way, we shall meet a handful of Jovian alter egos from around the world, including Zeus, Baal, Indra, Marduk, Hadad, Amun-Re, Thor, Teshub, Bolontiku, Ninurta, and Ningirsu. Luminous details conserved across cultures in parallel patterns will help us establish a visual vocabulary that clearly denotes and differentiates Jovian references and associations previously obscured by Saturnian misidentifications. As old erroneous planetary identifications are laid to rest, a tighter chronology of planetary events may be established. And as the myths surrounding Jupiter and Saturn come to be viewed in proper perspective, as pre-literate cultural memories of actual historical circumstances, our modern-day beliefs, taboos, and superstitions, long held over from former ages of catastrophe, might also be seen in a new light. An earlier binary arrangement of the solar system is widely speculated to have been dominated by Proto-Jupiter and the Sun. An ancient satellite sharing a common barycenter with the Sun, Proto-Jupiter was likely comparable to a sub-brown dwarf star and may have been in an inflated hot phase of development at this time. So-called hot Jupiters, giant planets with masses comparable to Jupiter, orbiting extremely close to their host stars, are quite numerous in nearby star systems. In light of the abundance of these hot Jupiters, it was recently proposed that Jupiter likewise formed in the innermost parts of the primeval solar system. While the Jupiter we know has since cooled off and is now parked safely far away, the very fact that hot Jupiters exist in other systems at all is very real and remarkable, and suggests that the bodies in our solar system were not necessarily formed where we find them today. Indeed, an unresolved issue long besetting the Nice model is its inability to account for Saturn's relatively late arrival in the context of Jupiter's early formation and evolvement. Simulations consistently suggest that Saturn must have been either strangely absent or relatively far removed at this time. Cicero famously ascribed an ancient, wide-ranging, boundless course to Saturn that eventually necessitated Jupiter's intervention. While the actual beginning of the drama is difficult to pinpoint, there was eventually a point at which the two giants approached each other closely. Echoing Ralph Jurgen's suggestion that Saturn was the invading star to a Sun-Jupiter binary, modern cosmologists now seem to concur. Initially far away, Saturn swiftly approached Jupiter, accelerating exponentially in a runaway migration towards the Sun. Perhaps Proto-Saturn was initially captured by the Sun from beyond heliopause, or perhaps Proto-Saturn had been ejected into a far-ranging solar orbit by an earlier interplanetary encounter, eventually swinging back around to perihelion like a comet, converging on Proto-Jupiter and the Sun. No matter how its inbound trajectory was originally initiated, Proto-Saturn would possess an accumulated charge potential befitting colder, more distant reaches of space. As such, Proto-Saturn would be likely to sport a preponderance of positive voltage with respect to the relatively low-voltage Sun-Jupiter binary. Thus, Proto-Saturn would eventually be captured by Jupiter and the Sun simply because their opposite charges would attract and draw them closer and closer together. The Saturnist model of Proto-Saturn as an extrasolar interloper with a grossly mismatched charge potential hence fills a distinct narrative void in the Nice model. The sudden jump in eccentricities had a drastic effect on the system as a whole. The Saturnian planets were wrenched out of polar alignment as their respective spin rates accelerated in response to the Saturn system's displaced forward momentum. The multi-resonant state was suddenly broken, permanently upsetting the primeval state of our solar system. No longer axially synchronized, individual charge sheets formed around each planet as the conjoined plasmasphere of Jupiter and Saturn subdivided, electrically isolating them from one another. Saturn was displaced from its polar position, and the gaseous envelope surrounding the Saturnian planets began to disperse. The Nice model notably suggests that the instability that our multi-resonant planetary system suffered was quite likely to be severe, given that the initial interplanetary separations were smaller. That is, when the initial planetary configuration is more compact, more interplanetary encounters will occur when the configuration is scattered. Outbound migrations will be rapidly excited and accelerated. The migrating planets will be driven more distantly from the original configuration, and the more spaced out with respect to each other will displaced planets eventually be. Earth appears to have been the furthest body below the conjoined orbits of the other Saturnian planets. Earth would have been a considerable distance vertically below Jupiter also. In such an arrangement, Earth and its synchronous Saturnian companions would pass by Jupiter roughly once with every yearly revolution around the Sun. A visually distorted Jupiter may have been occasionally visible in the north skies when Jupiter and Saturn were near conjunction. Under such conditions, Jupiter would have appeared as a bright upturned crescent, horn, or sickle backlit by the Sun. Lore regarding the end of the Golden Age, the celestial mill revolving in the sky above Earth's north pole churned out first gold, then salt, then sand and stones, before it finally sank into the sea. The Greeks specifically associated Kronos with blizzards of snow and hail, remembered as the planet god's weapons at war. The theme of Saturn being tied up or put in these chains specifically by Jupiter was also recalled globally. In Platonic lore, Kronos was put in chains by Zeus to restrain his boundless course and to bind him in the network of the stars. At the same time, it was said, Zeus also surrounded himself in bands and belts. In placing bonds about his father, he at the same time bound himself. By these means, Zeus bound himself subject to his own laws as well. This episode of the Jupiter-Saturn myth has of course been subsequently verified, first by telescope and later by robot videography. Saturn is indeed in chains and fetters. Jupiter is indeed shrouded in bands and belts. Surely, in distant times, these two great bodies must have been much closer to the Earth for their physical attributes to be so vividly and prominently presented. He defeated Saturn and the Sun by his brilliance, we are told in Vedic literature. It was then that Zeus became Lord of the bright skies. A stellar history for Jupiter was, in fact, much in vogue among mainstream astronomers through the 17th to 19th centuries, when popular astronomy famously speculated on the nature of Jupiter as a dark star. A hypothesis revived during the second half of the 20th century in light of the considerable implications suggested by data recovered from orbiting satellites and interplanetary explorers. Jupiter's wide-ranging variety of active emanations, infrared, radio, X-ray, and ultraviolet among them, have led others to consider Jupiter as a failed sun, or a star yet to be. Below Jupiter's glowing globe appeared a long beard, mantle, or cloak trailing all the way to the horizon below, a stupendous plume of plasma extending away from Jupiter's south geographic pole. This plasma expulsion would have been primarily an inflow of electrons, but simultaneously also an outflow of protons and other dissociated ions. Appearing as a steep, elongated cone, Jupiter's southern expulsion was also characterized as his royal mountain, or throne of glory. In the Kabbalah, this appearance is remembered as the long-bearded Arik Anpin, the extended countenance of the newly crowned star god. He let out his throne above and stretched a part of his glory below. And the Ancient of Days did sit. His throne was fiery flame, and his wheels burning fire. For a cloak and armor of terror, with a fearsome halo his head was turbaned. On the other side of the world, Viracocha was similarly remembered as a tall, glowing, bearded man dressed in a long, flowing cloak, who came in a time of chaos to set the world to rights. In the following centuries, peoples throughout the world began constructing mountains of chalk and pyramids of stone, sometimes square, sometimes star-shaped, sometimes round, in the image of such polar plasma expulsions. These were the high places, so often mentioned in the Hebrew books, on which the idolaters sacrificed to foreign gods. Much more recently, a comparable plasma expulsion has been witnessed emanating from both poles of protoplanetary nebula HD 44179. The distinct rungs, or steps of this conical ejection, are remarkably comparable to early pyramids, ziggurats, and mounds, and suggest that those imitative architectures were purposeful representations of what was visibly seen in the night skies by our ancestors here below. A smaller, less intense plasma discharge impinged at Jupiter's north geographic pole. This discharge appears to have bifurcated into two or more distinct flow vortices, broadening like plumes as they trailed away above the glowing globe. Seen from a distance, this expulsion was suggestive of horns, antennae, or a feather headdress. On some representations, these plasma plumes appear as wavering rays emanating from Jupiter's shoulders, such as in representations of Marduk. Even more impressive would have been the equatorial belts of glowing plasma within Jupiter's coma. The left and right cross-sections, where the toroid belts appeared most densely lit, stood out dramatically as two bright, watchful, and immobile eyes staring back at humankind. Eye icon figurines and amulets, with dramatically glaring open eyes, have been recovered in the Near East by the tens of thousands, and similar motifs are found as petroglyphs, as engravings on the walls of barrows, cave paintings, and other artifacts recovered globally. Identified by Anthony Peratt as a low-opacity torus, the most intense plasma currents would be concentrated at the center and be surrounded by a number of concentric shells. The fact that other facial features were less readily apparent was suggestive to some cultures of the god as wearing a mask or helmet. In later eras, this was further stylized as a totemic owl with garishly oversized eyes, sacred to Athena and Minerva, but also to Lilith and Moloch. The symbolism of the dreadful all-seeing owl has continued to mesmerize members of secret societies to this very day.
Hey, kabongs are thick as flies around here.
Kabong!
Hey, watch it, will you, Quick Straw?
Gosh, I'm sorry, Baba Louie. I was overcome by a kabongin' frenzy.
Both gravitational attraction and electrical repulsion are functions of the inverse of the separating distance, the square of the distance for gravitation. But the magnetic field of Saturn within the plasmasphere would reshape the electrical field intensity to the apple shape of the magnetosphere of Saturn. Thus, only the gravitational attraction would be spherical. The electrical repulsion would be shaped by the magnetic lines of force within Saturn's plasmasphere, with a region of lower electrical potential, and thus lesser repulsive force. At the two dimple locations of the apple shape, at this location, neither force would overwhelm the other, and a stable balance point could be reached between the two planets. At a much greater separation, if the plasmaspheres of the two planets touch, they will reform to become a single enclosing plasmasphere. The planets will then sense each other's electrical charge, and repulsive forces will result. Since both will be negative, this will be followed immediately by an induction of opposite voltages in one of the planets, resulting in a sudden increased difference in voltage between the two, causing an attractive electrical force between them, but also resulting in an attempt at charge equalization. Because of the voltage difference, electrical arcs or thunderbolts will pass between the two planets.
Groovy.
The electric universe almost suffices to explain just about every riddle that there is, and as we go on I can show you more of what I'm talking about. But another riddle is solved by this exchange of thunderbolts between the planets. Myths in the American Northwest that the Grand Canyon was carved out in a day, and Mars is known as the planet that had the closest approaches with Earth. So Mars and Earth would have exchanged thunderbolts, and the radiation that was released during those exchanges would have pretty much killed anybody that was in the area to try to carve it into a rock. But if you just look at the Grand Canyon from space, you can see that it looks like it was carved out electrically. It even has taken on the shape of a barred spiral galaxy, and it's the same thing with galaxies, and right down to little experiments on a table in a garage. You can experiment pretty much anything. But this also explains the asteroids and comets that are out there floating around by the thousands. It's a much better explanation for them than for them to be leftovers and dirty snowballs, which we've already covered, and we know that they're not, that bring water. I mean, these planets were encased in brown dwarfs' plasma sheaths, and they were constantly being watered on, sediment, growing in atmosphere, and brown dwarfs are even admitted by mainstream that they have these qualities. So it's not really so far-fetched. It's a lot more believable than the accretion model. Also in phase 2, when Jupiter and Saturn created the vortex with the subpolar alignment, they would have been covered in what is said in the Jupiter myth as a phosphorescence, a rainy canopy. So it rained for a very long period of time, and all you got to do is take a look at the Sphinx, which very many archaeologists, well, alternative archaeologists, say that has been there for at least 26,000 years, for sure 12,000. So that explains your precipitation lines in the rock strata there. Plus it explains the water line on all the pyramids. A body of water sat there for a long time. The fact that the Milky Way is seen in the sky at an angle has always puzzled astronomers. If we originated from the Milky Way, we ought to be orientated to the galaxy's ecliptic, with the planets aligned around our Sun in much the same angle as our Sun aligns with the Milky Way. Instead, as first suggested by researcher Matthew Perkins Irwin, the odd angle suggests that our Sun is influenced by some other system. Together with data from the 2-micron all-sky survey, we now know what it is. We actually belong to the Sagittarius Dwarf galaxy. We sifted several thousand interesting stars from a catalog of 500 million. By turning our maps of the sky to the right kind of star, the Sagittarius jumped into view. Both stars and star clusters now in outer parts of the Milky Way have been stolen from Sagittarius. I guess they don't take into consideration that our solar system was in a car accident. For only a few percent of its 240 million year orbit around the Milky Way does our solar system pass through the path of Sagittarius debris. Remarkably, stars from Sagittarius are now raining down onto our present position in the Milky Way. Stars from an alien galaxy are relatively near us. We have to rethink our assumptions about the Milky Way to account for this contamination. It has been postulated that this is the real reason for both global warming, since higher energy levels of the Milky Way are almost certain to cause our Sun to burn hotter and emit higher energies. Indeed, temperatures have been seen to rise on virtually all of the planets in our system. This seems quite apart from any local phenomena like greenhouse gases, etc. The grand turning is possibly the root cause for the discontinuation of the Mayan calendar, the most accurate on the planet, because the read point of the Pleiades star cluster, which many believe the calendar was based on, can no longer be a constant as we begin to steer away from the earlier predictable movements. The marriage of our birth galaxy and the new adopted Milky Way galaxy is causing energy shifts that are obvious just about everywhere. Here are some of the changes being watched by scientists. A growth of dark spots on Pluto, reporting auroras on Saturn, reporting of Uranus and Neptune's polar shifts. They are magnetically conjunct planets. And the abrupt large-scale growth of Uranus magnetosphere intensity, a change in light intensity and light spot dynamics on Neptune, the doubling of the magnetic field intensity on Jupiter, a series of new states and processes observed, a series of Martian atmosphere transformations increasing its biosphere quality, in particular, a cloudy growth in the equator area, unusual growth of ozone concentration. Oh, so Mars has ozone, but we're losing ours. The moon seems to be growing an atmosphere. A first stage atmosphere generation on the moon, where a growing natrium atmosphere is detected that reaches 9,000 kilometers in height. Significant physical, chemical, and optical changes observed on Venus. An inversion of dark and light spots detected. A sharp decrease of sulfur containing gases in the atmosphere. A change in the quality of interplanetary space towards an increase in its interplanetary and solar planetary transmitting properties. I just thought that this was an interesting article. I have it attached below if you want to check it out. Modern science proclaims the solar system is 4.5 billion years old, and outside of an extinction event every so many million years, not much changes except that the continents are on tectonic plates and they move an inch or so every year, 100 years. But there's another story, and it was first promulgated that I know of by Immanuel Velikovsky, that the history of our current solar system is much more recent than billions of years of Earth going around the sun, as any and all dating methods have been proven unreliable. Watch this.
Now, from a scientific point of view, what are we told? We're told, yes, we have an ice age. This ice age happened in what we know as the Pleistocene epoch, and before the ice age, there was nothing. Men walked around in skins, and Neanderthal man, hunter-gatherers. No such concept as Atlantis or Lemuria or any other advanced civilization could possibly have existed. So what is the tenets of the official theory? Well, the high priests of geology were of Charles Lyell. He was the exponent of the theory of uniformity. That simply means that through the geological record, nature, evolution, all of these things are incrementally slow. Very, very slow movements of development over vast expanses of time. Louis Agassiz, he was the exponent of the glacial theory, exponent of the ice ages. And particularly Professor James Geekie, geology professor, Edinburgh University, a major champion of the ice age theory. And believe me, that's all it is, a theory, as we're about to see. Now, the ice ages are meant to have taken place, geologically speaking, in what is known as the Pleistocene epoch. This is the epoch lasting 2 million years that is housing what we know as the ice age. But Professor James Geekie says, if there is anything more fantastic than Geekie's extravagant theory, it is that it has been lapped up by his successors and by intelligent men who, by logic alone, should be able to denounce it. Yet it is today a dogma. This is Commons Beaumont, one of the most suppressed scholars of all time, talking about Geekie's findings. He says it's unsustainable, simply a dogma. Communist Beaumont goes on to say, the flood, to the world generally a vague and nebulous tradition, really conceals the most appalling visitation, and its ravages in the British Isles and Scandinavian lands may be retraced to more considerable extent by the effects of what geologists term the drift age. It was no mere ice drift, it was a sudden and terribly swift and violent. So Beaumont was one of the great catastrophists. Along with Immanuel Velikovsky, he was a person who decried and did not believe in or subscribe to the uniformitarian philosophy. he understood that we had been visited by tremendously swift cataclysms of the past. And he spent his life trying to refute what Geikie and the uniformitarianists were advancing. And in the fine book, When the Earth Nearly Died, by Allen and Dallaire, they say, it is an astonishing that such an unscientific explanation ever came to be formulated, yet in a short time both it and the concept of immense, thick ice sheets descending from a hypothetical northern mountain system was enthusiastically embraced as virtually established fact. They go on to write, the evidence is perfectly unambiguous, along with the removal of an ice age like that which is hitherto commonly envisaged. The evidence suggests that there is something seriously amiss with the last phases of standard geological chronology. Now, these unsustainable theories of ice ages and drift ages has been refuted in the 90s by several authors, not only Allen and Dallaire, but by Michael Cremo in his monumental work Forbidden Archaeology, and more specifically by the Observer magazine scientific writer Robert Milton, who wrote a fine book called Shattering the Myths of Darwin. Now, Clifford Wilson, in his book, The Chariots Still Crash, he says, some dates obtained by other radiometric methods are seriously astray, such as the age of millions of years being attributed to volcanic rocks in Hawaii, which are known to be less than 200 years old. This is reported in the Journal of Geophysical Research. It is known that these lava rocks were actually formed in 1800 and 1801 in Hualai in Hawaii. The potassium-argon dating methods was utilized, and a formation age of 160 million to 3 billion years were given for this rock formation, which was known to be just over 170 years old. This is not an isolated report. Rock samples from 12 volcanoes in Russia and 10 samples from other places around the world, all known to be of recent age, that is, formed within the last 200 years, when dated by the uranium, thorium, lead method, gave ages varying from millions to billions of years. So here's your science for you. But luckily, a lot of these scientific findings are now being seriously refuted, and we need to know about this. Clifford Wilson goes on to say, there is increasing evidence to suggest that those figures of millions of years, which we were given in our childhood, must be put to one side. And indeed they must. But what would happen if they are? What happens if we suddenly start to question these Royal Academy and Royal Society dates and figures and scholarship? Well, then the truth of what might be behind that Pleistocene epoch, I mean, if you concertine the whole 2 million year Pleistocene epoch out of existence, suddenly you have no ice ages, no substantial ice ages, and therefore no great wall between our time and the past. Evidence thus converges from numerous directions to support the conclusion that on the testimony of radiocarbon and other dating techniques, immense physical and climatic changes occurred on Earth some 11,000 years or so ago, when an ice age that probably never existed came to an end, and the apparently uniformitarian regime was abruptly terminated. There you are. That's Allen and Dallaire saying that something happened so much more recently, and it had very little to do with an ice age. Thus, if many of today's highest mountains were much lower when the alleged ice age was reputedly at its zenith, then how did so much ice, if it actually existed, manage to accumulate? Indeed, we can take a step further and ask whether the ice sheets so beloved of the glacialists ever existed at all. Now, these two geologists have discovered that the mountains that are quite high today all over the world were not as high 11,000 years ago. Well, of course, that goes to the heart of the glacialists' theory. You have to have very high peaks in order to have the cold for the ice sheets to be created. But if they actually were being told, then there goes your ice theory right out the window. They go on to say, the time allegedly occupied by the glacial and interglacial episodes of conventional Pleistocene chronology was actually non-existent. Now, how come we have not heard worldwide debate about this book or of Robert Milton's Shattering Myths of Darwinism?
Could have said it yesterday, the suppression of uncomfortable ideas may be common in religion or in politics, but it is not the path to knowledge, and there's no place for it in the endeavor of science. We do not know beforehand where fundamental insights will arise from about our mysterious and lovely solar system. The history of our study of our solar system shows us clearly that accepted and conventional ideas are often wrong, and that fundamental insights can arise from the most unexpected sources. Carl Sagan.
phys.org titled Stellar Mystery Deepens. A Monash University-led research team made an unexpected discovery that a large group of stars are dying prematurely, challenging our accepted view of stellar evolution. Their results revealed that large numbers of helium-burning stars are dying prematurely in the M4 globular cluster. Professor Latanzio from the Max Planck Institute for Astrophysics said, "Globular clusters are some of the oldest objects in the universe. Although we have some ideas for what is going on in them, every time we look carefully we find something unexpected. They are both fascinating and frustrating at the same time." The international team found that about half of the stars tend to skip the red giant phase, instead becoming white dwarfs millions of years ahead of schedule. Demonstrating once again what's wrong with the modern scientific method, characterized as shut up and simulate, Professor Latanzio continued, "Computer simulations do not agree with this observation. So, as well as continuing observations, new computer models will need to be generated to better understand what is taking place in the cores of these stars. But the computer models are built on missing or invalid concepts. There's nothing going on in the cores of stars, and globular clusters are not understood. So the mathematical computer simulations produce a virtual, unreal cosmos that, like the movies, can be programmed to produce anything you can imagine. And the artist's impressions we see in science reports are little more than glossy advertising material, but much more deceptive because it is falsely labelled real science. There is no real mystery here. With no nuclear fire inside, stars don't die by bloating to a red giant and collapsing to a white dwarf as their fire goes out. The life and death stories of stars are fictional. The bloated appearance of red giants is not due to internal pressure caused by hypothetical helium burning at 100 million degrees in the core of a star. It is a purely electrical effect witnessed in laboratory low-pressure gas discharge tubes. Red stars are those that satisfy their need for electrons from the surrounding plasma by expanding the surface area over which they collect electrons by growing a large plasma sheath that becomes the effective anode in space. The growth process is self-limiting because as the sheath expands, its electric field grows stronger. Electrons caught up in the field are accelerated until they become energetic enough to excite neutral particles they chance to collide with, and the huge sheath becomes a uniform red anode glow. It becomes a red giant star. The electric field driving this process will also give rise to a massive flow of positive ions away from the star, or in more conventional terms, a prodigious stellar wind. Such loss of matter is a characteristic feature of red giants. Standard stellar theory is at a loss to explain this since the star is said to be too cold to boil off a stellar wind. Arthur Eddington himself expressed his puzzlement about white dwarfs. Strange objects which persist in showing a type of spectrum entirely out of keeping with their luminosity may ultimately teach us more than a host which radiates according to rule. He was right. A white dwarf appears extremely hot, white and underluminous because it is a faint white coronal discharge. As usual, a thin plasma sheath will be formed between the plasma of the star and the plasma of space. The electric field across the plasma sheath is capable of accelerating electrons to generate ultraviolet light and X-rays when they hit atoms in the atmosphere, and the power dissipated is capable of raising the temperature of a thin plasma layer to tens of thousands of degrees. The spectral lines are broadened, sometimes to the point of disappearance, due to the coronal electric field. This gives the misleading impression that hydrogen, whose spectral lines are smeared the most, is missing in many of these stars, and that therefore they are remnants of larger stars that have conventionally lost or burned their hydrogen fuel. So, globular clusters are not some of the oldest objects in the universe. Their spherical shape of a dense collection of stars and their elliptical orbits about the galactic centre hint at a quasar-style birth process from the plasmoid at the heart of the galaxy. If so, the electromagnetic environment inside the globular cluster is different to that in open clusters of stars, so we should expect an unusual distribution of white dwarfs and red giant stars. And the puzzling observation that some globular cluster stars have 100 times more iron than others could also be explained by electromagnetic sorting of elements within the globular cluster at its birth. The fact we don't understand stars in the 21st century highlights what Arthur Koestler wrote in The Sleepwalkers. The history of cosmic theories in particular may without exaggeration be called a history of collective obsessions and controlled schizophrenia, and the manner in which some of the most important individual discoveries were arrived at reminds one more of a sleepwalker's performance than an electronic brain's. Science is still in its childhood, and we behave as infants. We give far too much credit to scientists for knowing what they are talking about.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to Thunderbolts.info.
Because the word sol actually means alone or solitary. Well, the original word for the moon, luna, also is a derivation of the word alone. Luna, the lone one. Why are they called the alone ones? Because they understood, the ancients understood, that they are alone now. Because they had a cousin, they had a twin, the second son, and the second son is no longer there. So from that time onwards, in order to commemorate this celestial cataclysm, the sun and the moon were called the alone ones. That's their title, that's their name. In fact, the very words we use today to signify travesty also commemorate exactly what we were talking about. The word disaster comes from the two words dis, which means to be without or to be with loss, and aster is the word for star, no star. Disaster literally means no star. And the word catastrophe also means kata, to break down or to destroy, and strophe, which was star. So the destruction or the breaking up of a star. We use these same terms today to denote when something horrible, calamity has happened to us. Now, of course, it may seem quite far-fetched to accept any of this, and certainly the idea that torrents of water, ice and rain and what have you, is pouring into our atmosphere, into the earth, because to actually accept that is also to accept the fact that before this water presence was felt on our earth, that there may have been substantially much less water and probably no oceans as we know it today. That's a pretty far-fetched concept, is it not? But yet, that's what the ancient mythologies are telling us, that before the waters came down from the heavens, our earth was, relatively speaking, without a lot of water. There's a concept known to geologists as Pangaea. This concept is that the fact that Europe and Africa were originally coterminous with North and South America. That means all the land masses made a supercontinent called Pangaea, the whole Earth.
The gigantic worldwide tectonic disturbances of the late Pleistocene times occurred almost simultaneously on a near unimaginable scale, precisely what could be expected from a powerful external influence, but not from the Ice Age, conditions conventionally believed to have existed then. Significantly, a drop in the strength of the Earth's magnetic field appears to have occurred sometime between 13,750 and 12,350 years ago, attended by various other important changes, including earthquakes, volcanism, water table fluctuations, and the large-scale climatic variations. Of these severe earthquakes, in particular, may even include axial Wal.
Mountains were born and mountains collapsed. Land and sea changed places. Great streams of lava flowed. The sea boiled and evaporated. Such were the scenes of unimaginable violence during the times of global catastrophe, as recorded by the ancients.
Here in the New York Herald Tribune, Explosion in Science, the artist's conception of what happened when the heavens burst. What happened during the 1500 BC upheaval, which we read about in the Bible as the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, and the phenomena or upheaval that accompanied that. And this is the artist's conception of what happened in Palestine and Mexico and China. Lightning, meteorites being rained down as the comet's head came closer to the Earth, followed by floods. Same in Mexico, where water swept over the entire land, great gigantic tides.
There were repeated changes in the Earth's orbit, in the lengths of day, the seasons, and the year. In these catastrophes, entire species of animals were annihilated. Others proliferated from wholesale mutations. Mankind was decimated. Civilizations destroyed. The papyrus of Ipuwer synchronized biblical and Egyptian events and led to a reconstruction of ancient history. Many questions debated for centuries found an answer. In the Bible, the identity of the beautiful Queen of Sheba at the court of Solomon was unknown. In Egyptian records, the land of Punt, visited by Queen Hatshepsut, could not be determined. In Velikovsky's reconstruction, it is clear that Punt is the land of Solomon and Hatshepsut is the Queen of Sheba. The biblical story of Joshua, with the sun standing still in Gibeon and the moon in the valley of Ajalon, presented another realization.
I was struck by the fact that 2 lines or 2 verses before the story of the sun and moon disturbed in their daily motion was the story of large stones that fell from the sky and destroyed more of the enemy soldiers than the sword of the Israelite. On this combination, because combination of stones and disturbance in rotation of the earth, the ancients could not know that it was the earth that was disturbed in rotation. They thought the moon and the sun. Made me immediately to follow the path toward east and west. And I found without great difficulty that in Western Hemisphere, which means here, on this continent, the story persists too. The story persists among the Redskins, it persisted among the Mayas, at the time when the continent was first conquered, the Mexico part of it, by the Spaniards, namely that the sun was rising just over the eastern horizon when it dropped back and came a little up again and stand there without motion, and all the forests burned. Again, the Redskin could not know about the heat resulting from disturbance in the Earth's rotation. So, of course, this would be not enough. You had to go to all civilization, to Japan, to China, to India, to Persia, to Babylonia, to Assyria, to Asia Minor, to Greece, to Rome, to Judea, to Egypt, to Mexico, to Peru, to Iceland, and for oral transmission even to East Indies. And the same story could have been found in all places, but differently told, so that it was no question of just borrowing from one nation by another. So this was the conclusion, the story of human memory of catastrophes that took place in historical times, but strangely, despite the fact that they were described in so many sources, as if non-existent for the scientific world.
Other ancient documents tell of the thunderbolts of the planet god Jupiter. Velikovsky understood that these thunderbolts referred to electromagnetic discharges between planets. This led to his claim that radio noises must emanate from Jupiter. In 1955, radio noises from Jupiter were discovered. It was this prediction and discovery that finally convinced Einstein of the merit of Velikovsky's ideas. This prediction and confirmation of radio noises from Jupiter convinced Einstein to seek crucial experiments on Velikovsky's ideas. After Einstein's death, his estate wrote letters to this effect, but with no result.
One of the most interesting cases that are these mammoths that are frozen in the Yukon or in Alaska, frozen in the muck and the gravel of that area, that still have food in their mouths. The flesh has been preserved in the ice, so that actually when they were dug out, when they were digging for gold, they could actually feed the flesh of these animals to sledge dogs. Whatever happened happened suddenly, as for example the tilting of the axis of the Earth and freezing them right there where they were found. Why did the ancients worship stars or planets that the average person can't pick out of the sky today? And yet all of our ancient heritage that comes to us in terms of architecture, writing, and so on, they're actually obsessed with the idea of worshiping these stars, these dreaded planets. All mankind through the years have worshipped stars that we can't even pick out of the sky today. Now why? Why were they so obsessed with them? Unless in some way these stars were threats to them, in some way impressed themselves upon ancient man.
A book like Old Testament is read maybe more than any other book through the centuries. It's translated to all languages. And you read there about sea and land changing places, about mountain moving into the sea, mountain being overturned, mountain melting like wax. And you think that this is metaphors. And so it is the phenomenon that Freud stressed and stressed again, of the role of traumatic experience on the life of an individual. But he stressed also another point, namely that the victim of this partial amnesia lives under the urge to repeat the traumatic experience, sometimes changing roles, making somebody else the victim. And mankind today, advanced enough in technology, produced thermonuclear weapons that could be like symbol or something representing the ancient, violent, celestial bodies that through fire and smoke disturbed the rotation of the earth. Now, if man is under the urge to repeat the ancient catastrophic events, the ancient trauma, are we not in a predicament? It is not a preaching to be better. It is a preaching to know yourself.
Dr. Velikovsky, what do you think is the effect of this collective amnesia in the future?
The effect is very great, not only in the future, it was also in the past. Because as long as a man doesn't remember his past, he acts as a neurotic, a person who suffered a traumatic experience. Due to this traumatic experience, suffered also an amnesia, a local amnesia, so to say, not spread through all his personality, but in this case, in the human race, we have something that is comparable with a single personality that suffered a trauma.
cosmic upheavals, just like Beaumont was implying there, the cosmic upheavals that happen in the heavens above us were often stylized in myths as the conflicts between Rama and Ravana, let's say, or Horus and Set, or Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, if you are from the Persian persuasion, or Arthur and Mordred, or St. George and his dragon, you see, and Christ and Satan. A lot of these mythological adversarial conflicts are actually illustrations, motifs, portrayals of something that happened cosmically. This has now been accepted. Allen and Dallaire, in their book Cataclysm, say that giant electromagnetic storms, lightning, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, stupendous hurricanes, abruptly displaced bodies of water, celestial bombardment, rains of astonishing volume, and a mighty flood are all quick-acting violent events. There's that key term, quick-acting. These are individuals who are now putting aside this idea of slow, gradual, gradations of change over vast areas of time. Now, these two characters who've written this book, Cataclysm, and who wrote the book When the Earth Nearly Died, who are these individuals? Well, D.S. Allen is Cambridge University science historian specializing in paleography. His colleague, J.B. Dallaire, is Oxford University geologist, anthropologist, and museum creator of geology at the University of Southampton. These characters come out with a book, When the Earth Nearly Died, and their other one, Cataclysm, in the 90s. And the science is in to prove that the uniformitarian theories are just not sustainable, and that Darwinian theories are not sustainable. But how come we have not heard universal debate about these works? These are the top specialists in their field. And yet we go to high school, we turn on the television, we read in the journals and the magazines and the newspapers the same old regurgitated Royal Academy, Royal Society information, as if nothing has ever changed. In those days, Noah saw the earth that it had sunk low, and its destruction was nigh. And he arose from thence and went to the end of the earth. Of course, I had questioned how did he manage to do that. Anyway, it says he went to the end of the earth and cried aloud to his grandfather Enoch. And Noah said bitterly 3 times, Hear me, hear me, hear me. And I, Enoch, said unto him, Tell me what it is that is falling upon the earth, that it is in such evil plight and shaken. Book of Enoch again. And the moon shall alter her order, and not appear in her own time. And many chief stars shall transgress their prescribed order, and these shall alter their orbits and tasks, and not appear as the seasons proper to them. And the whole order of the stars shall be concealed from the sinners, and evil shall be multiplied upon them, and punishment shall come upon them so as to destroy all. In Scandinavian mythology, they have a reference to it as well, although it's again figurative, it's mythological. They have the Midgard serpent, their great enemy, their great adversarial agency there, the Midgard serpent, blows so much poison that the whole sky and the sea are splattered with it. Here we have the essence of fable. Here we have the essence of allegory, that something stands in for something else. This is the way the ancients commemorated the histories that they knew. So for us to look back with contempt is outrageous. Allen and Dallaire, in Cataclysm, traditionally the destruction was almost always associated with water in one form or another. That's right, not so much ice, but with water cataclysm. This is where the myth of the great deluge came from. They go on to say, ancient Mesopotamian texts repeatedly allude to the original watery nature of Tiamat. From such fragments, we may conclude that Tiamat was essentially a watery planet, and that very large quantities of water were probably dispersed into space during Tiamat's destruction. Well, we can enlarge upon that by saying, yes, water, if the planet Tiamat for some mysterious reason gets destroyed and its waters, its ocean waters are blown out into space, well, outer space is a cryogenic chamber, so we can expect a great deal of it also to coalesce as ice and huge fragments of ice, not only as liquid water. And sure enough, if we turn to the myths again, we find that what scientists are only discovering now in the most modern of times, hey, the ancient legends, they were saying it all along. In the famous book of Taliesin, this is a Welsh bard, a Welsh writing, a Welsh scripture. Taliesin was the equivalent of Merlin. A lot of people have heard of Merlin. Well, they had a Welsh equivalent. He was called Taliesin. They had an Irish equivalent, as I said earlier on. There was an Irish bard upon which Merlin was entirely based. But Taliesin, the Welsh version, in the triads of Taliesin, in the poetry of Wales, it has this to say: I have been in the bark of Dylan. A bark means boat. I have been in the boat of Dylan, son of the wave, when the waters rose as lances, falling down from the skies into the exposed abyss. I mean, there you've got it all in one sentence. Now in Revelation we have this well-debated term wormwood. Well, taken in context of what I'm presenting here, let's revisit this. Wormwood, the famous wormwood, the bitter waters. Okay, it says in Revelation 8, and the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as if it were a lamp. And the name of that star is called wormwood, and many men died of the water because they were made bitter. Bitter waters falling onto the earth. In Cataclysm, we have a passage from the mythologies of the Navajo Indians of North America. Long ago, they say, the Navajo ancestors were surprised one day to see animals of every type running from east to west. 4 days later, they saw a bright light in the east, and those sent to investigate it returned with the news that it was a vast flood of water proceeding in their direction. Next morning, this flood had drawn quite close, and filling the entire horizon, except the west, advanced like a chain of high mountains. Numerous surviving accounts describe the waters advancing like a colossal wave or wall of stupendous height and irresistible power. The relatively abrupt release of the waters, piled up by Kingu and Phaeton's combined gravitational influence, will have inevitably produced a deluge having precisely these characteristics. Now, Allen and Dallaire have hypothesized about Tiamat, but they're also more of the persuasion that it was a comet entering into our solar system by the name of Kingu that caused this. So again, it's up to you to do the research and discover which philosophy you believe. Was it an already existing planet in our solar system that destroyed? Or, as the Sumerians and Zecharia Sitchin and others are hypothesizing, was it the intervention of a cometary body that shook up our particular solar system? They go on to say the Zend-Avesta, this is a very famous book in Persia. Zend-Avesta mentions that when Tisthria assaulted Earth, it sent tremendous rains in which the drops were the size of saucers or of a man's head and were sometimes boiling hot. Now in the Norse Edda, during Odin, his battle with the Fenris wolf, the upper heaven is alleged to have been shattered, its wreckage plummeting to earth as hail and huge blocks of ice. So I would challenge anyone to explain what this is. Now you can see why so much of ancient mythology was just shunted to one side. Now you can understand why the marginalization campaign took place, because you simply can't explain it. Or at least you can't explain it with the tools that we've been given by the orthodox, by the official.
Edmund Halley was the first modern scientist to account for the deluge by polar displacement when he first argued his case before the Royal Society of London in 1692. The revelation was so startling that his paper was not published until 30 years after. Sounds familiar?
In India, there is an ancient belief still held by some in a subterranean race of serpent people who dwell in the cities Patala and Bhogavati. According to the legend, they wage war on the kingdom of Agartha. The Nagas, according to the deep dwellers, are described as a very advanced race or species with a highly developed technology. They also harbor a disdain for human beings, who they are said to abduct, torture, interbreed, and even to eat. And one might want to notice the prevalence of hollow earth motifs in movies, not just of Hollywood, but of movies in general. We have a great deal of movies in this world that feature hollow earth, some of them very famous, and people watch them all the time and never think of it. And yet they're seeing constant reference to this, not just in science fiction movies, but in many others.